Plato was born around 428 or 427 BCE in Athens, at a time when the city was entering a prolonged period of political instability and decline. Although Athens was still formally a democracy, its institutions were under strain from years of war, internal division, and social unrest. Plato was born into a wealthy and aristocratic family with deep political roots. His birth name was likely Aristocles, while the name Plato may have been a nickname referring to his physical appearance. From the beginning, his life was shaped by privilege, education, and close proximity to political power, and he was raised with the expectation that he would one day take part in public leadership. Plato's family connections placed him at the center of Athenian political life. His father, Ariston, claimed descent from the ancient kings of Athens. His mother, Perictino, was related to Solon, the lawgiver whose reforms had shaped Athenian political institutions centuries earlier. Several of Plato's relatives were actively involved in politics, most notably Critias and Charmides, who would later become leading members of the oligarchic government known as the 30 Tyrants. Because of this lineage, Plato was expected to pursue a political career and contribute directly to civic affairs, rather than withdraw into private life. During Plato's childhood and youth, Athens was consumed by the Peloponnesian War against Sparta. This long conflict dominated daily life and gradually weakened the city. Economic resources were drained, alliances collapsed, and public morale deteriorated. Plato grew up witnessing military defeat, political tension, and social division. By the time he reached adulthood, Athens was no longer the confident imperial power it had once been. Instead, it was a city marked by fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty, conditions that deeply influenced Plato's understanding of politics and leadership. Plato received the education typical of an aristocratic Athenian youth. He studied poetry, grammar, music, mathematics, and physical training, disciplines intended to cultivate both intellect and character. He was immersed in the works of Homer, Hesiod, and the Greek tragedians, whose writings explored ambition, power, justice, and moral failure. He likely received training in rhetoric, the essential skill for political success in a democratic society. At this stage of his life, Plato appeared destined for a conventional political path shaped by elite education and family expectation. A decisive shift occurred when Plato encountered Socrates. Plato met Socrates sometime in his late teens or early 20s, at a time when Socrates was already well known in Athens for his public questioning. Unlike Plato's aristocratic peers, Socrates lived simply and rejected political ambition. He spent his days questioning politicians, poets, and craftsmen about virtue, justice, and wisdom. Despite his lack of status and wealth, Socrates possessed a moral seriousness and intellectual intensity that profoundly affected Plato. Through Socrates, Plato encountered a radically different view of politics. Socrates argued that political power without moral knowledge was dangerous, and that most leaders did not truly understand the values they claimed to defend. Rather than teaching persuasion or political strategy, Socrates focused on examining beliefs and exposing ignorance. This approach challenged the foundations of Athenian political culture, which rewarded popularity, rhetorical skill, and public image rather than careful reflection. Plato became a close companion of Socrates and observed him closely. He watched Socrates question influential figures in public spaces and reveal the weakness of their claims to wisdom. At the same time, Plato witnessed the resentment this behavior provoked. Many Athenians felt humiliated or threatened by Socrates' questioning, particularly as young people began to admire and imitate him. Plato saw how a society that claimed to value wisdom could become hostile toward those who genuinely pursued it. As Plato matured, he grew increasingly aware of the gap between philosophical ideals and political reality. Athenian democracy celebrated freedom and equality, yet political leadership often depended on persuasion rather than understanding. Decisions were shaped by emotion, fear, and self-interest rather than reason. Plato began to doubt whether such a system could ever produce justice, regardless of its ideals. The defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War in 404 BCE marked a turning point. The city surrendered to Sparta, its empire collapsed, and its democratic institutions were dismantled. In their place, Sparta supported an oligarchic government known as the 30 Tyrants. Several of Plato's relatives, including Critias and Charmides, became leading figures in this regime. Initially, Plato hoped that this government might restore order after years of chaos and war. These hopes were quickly destroyed. The 30 tyrants ruled through executions, confiscations, and intimidation. They eliminated political opponents and governed without regard for law or justice. Plato later reflected that this regime proved even more corrupt and violent than the democracy it replaced. During this period, Plato witnessed a defining event when Socrates was ordered by the oligarchs to participate in an unjust arrest. Socrates refused, risking his life rather than committing injustice. This act reinforced Plato's belief that moral integrity was rare in political life, and often punished rather than rewarded. After less than a year, the 30 tyrants were overthrown, and democracy was restored. Many Athenians hoped this would mark a return to justice and stability. Plato initially shared this hope, believing the city might have learned from its suffering. However, the restored democracy soon revealed the same weaknesses as before, particularly intolerance toward those who challenged public opinion or authority. In 399 BCE, the democratic government put Socrates on trial, charging him with impiety and corrupting the youth. Plato was deeply affected by this event. The trial demonstrated that democracy, like oligarchy, could act unjustly when driven by fear and resentment. Socrates was found guilty and executed, an event that shattered Plato's remaining faith in practical politics. The death of Socrates convinced Plato that no existing political system was capable of reliably producing justice. Oligarchy concentrated power and led to tyranny. Democracy elevated opinion over knowledge and led to instability. Both systems were governed by ignorance rather than understanding. Plato concluded that the problem was not merely institutional, but moral and intellectual. He later wrote that justice could exist only when philosophers ruled, or rulers became philosophers. Disillusioned and potentially at risk himself, Plato left Athens for several years. He traveled throughout the Greek world, including southern Italy and Sicily, and possibly Egypt. During these journeys, he encountered different political systems and philosophical traditions. In southern Italy, Plato came into contact with followers of Pythagoras, who emphasized mathematics, harmony, and eternal truths beyond the physical world. These experiences shaped Plato's philosophical outlook. He became increasingly convinced that reality extended beyond what could be seen or touched. Political systems were unstable and constantly changing, suggesting that true knowledge must concern something permanent and unchanging. From this conviction emerged his theory of forms, which held that concepts such as justice, beauty, and goodness exist as perfect, eternal realities beyond the physical world. Plato believed political systems failed because they attempted to govern society without understanding these higher truths. Leaders focused on appearances, opinions, and immediate advantage, rather than the nature of justice itself. His turn toward idealism was therefore not an escape from politics, but a response to its failures. Rather than seeking office, Plato chose to educate future leaders. Around 387 BCE, Plato returned to Athens and founded the Academy, a community dedicated to philosophical inquiry. Students studied mathematics, astronomy, ethics, and metaphysics, disciplines Plato believed trained the mind to grasp eternal truths. The Academy represented Plato's alternative to political participation, shaping politics indirectly through education rather than power. Plato's political vision was most fully expressed in the Republic. In this work, he described an ideal state governed by philosopher kings, rulers guided by knowledge of the good rather than personal ambition. He criticized democracy for valuing freedom without discipline, and warned that such conditions allowed demagogues to rise and become tyrants. He also criticized oligarchy for valuing wealth over virtue, believing it inevitably produced division and instability. Despite his idealism, Plato later attempted to influence politics directly during his journeys to Syracuse in Sicily, encouraged by Dion, who hoped to establish philosophical rule. These efforts ended in disappointment. Plato's advice was ignored. he faced serious danger, and the experience confirmed his belief that philosophy and political power were rarely compatible. Plato spent the remainder of his life teaching and writing at the academy. He lived until around 348 or 347 BCE. Although his ideal state was never realized, his influence endured through his writings and his students, including Aristotle. Plato's disillusionment with politics was not withdrawal or despair, but moral seriousness. Through philosophy, he preserved the idea that justice exists even when societies fail to embody it, transforming personal disappointment into one of the most influential visions of political idealism in history.